Awesome. Good morning, everyone. This is our last training of this session, so yay. We are, as usual, going to go over logistics before we pass it over to our awesome presenter to go over today's training material. As most of you already know, Zoom functions, but I'm going to go over them. Please use the mute and unmute function as necessary. That'll be at the bottom left-hand side of your screen. It's a little microphone. You can also use the space bar if you're on a PC. Please come off mute and engage in today's training. We definitely want you to be interactive, ask any questions. If you do have any background noise though, and things are going in the background, please mute while the presenter is presenting the material. But we do encourage you, if you have questions or want to engage in a presentation, to come off mute. Or you can use the chat function, which is on the right-hand side under participants. Just make sure next to two that you're clicking everyone in the meeting so we can all see your questions and engage with you in the chat as well. If you're having any technical difficulty or if you have any questions, go ahead and send me a message. Let me rename myself. Kaya, go ahead and send me a message if you have any questions and I can answer them and troubleshoot in the background. But yeah, I'm gonna pass the presenter mic over to Andrea and we're gonna start with today's presentation. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Kaya.
No problem.
Okay, so good morning. I've got a question for you guys before we start. This is addressing substance use in supportive housing. So how many people have taken this class before? Ever? Nobody? Nobody's taken it? Okay, so a conversation that Kaya and I just had is we weren't sure how many people were new to this class and how many people have taken it before. And if people are looking for new stuff, part of the thing in the required course.
Yes.
Okay. Part of the issue with the required courses is we want everybody to get the new information. We could certainly do a level 2 of these courses, but you got to ask for that. So if you've taken it before, you really don't need to be here because there's not a whole lot of new information. Okay, it's all the same information that we want to make sure everybody gets. Okay. All right. So let's talk about substance abuse. Okay, substance use. We're going to talk about roles of housing providers and supportive services, and I'll tell you why in a minute. We're going to talk about communication structures. We're going to talk about substance use and the effect on housing, how it plays into lease violations and eviction prevention, how you work with tenants to address the substance use issues and address the risky behaviors, which are slightly different. And then we're going to do some case studies, and then we're going to talk about some references that you guys can use, and then we're going to wrap it up. Okay, so substance use disorders. This is the DSM-5, 6, 7, whatever. Diagnosis for substance abuse disorders, and its current use resulting in a failure to fulfill a major role. So what I want you to look at, or obligations at school, home, or work. What I want you to look at is substance abuse diagnosis is based on a functional criteria, right? So you have to be able to meet your major obligations in order for a substance abuse diagnosis to be there. And the major functioning we're looking at is tenancy and using that to leverage either treatment or some sort of change in the substance abuse behavior. Does that make sense? Because that's really what our leverage is in supportive housing. Okay. So it's things like putting themselves at real risk or legal behaviors or not being able to manage tenancy, number one. And it occurs no matter what the consequences. So you may have an area, let's say, physically hazardous situations. All right. I don't know if you guys have ever had this, but we used to have a lot of people who were drinking a lot and they would have liver failure and their liver would bloat. So it looked like they were several months pregnant, right? Like 12. And they would have to get their liver drained, the fluid drained from their belly. Okay. So that would go with a pretty serious hazard physical condition, right? It's not just, You know, we also had a guy who used to lie down in traffic in New York City, right? He'd go from the bar to the building and he'd lie down in the middle of the street. Once again, physically hazardous condition. Okay, so those are extremes, right? But think of how substance abuse affects housing. Where do you see it? Before it really gets going, noise complaints. If somebody's got a lot of noise complaints, you want to pay attention to that. Is that always substance? Nope. But sometimes it is, right? And that when people are high, they like things louder. I don't know what that is. What, Bianca? Okay. What are other stuff? Substances cost money, right? So where do you see it? Think about it. Rent, right? You have people that run out of money I had people that ran out of the money by the first day of the month. They get their check, they cash it, and they'd be out of money, right? Not a lick of rent paid. Okay, there's a pretty good idea. People are addicted to something if they're doing that, right? What else? What do you see? How about friends coming in? Somebody's always got a bunch of people in their apartment. Do you suspect substance abuse? I do. Is it always substance abuse? Nope. What are the other symptoms that affect housing that are early warning signs? What are you seeing? Put it in the chat box if you don't want to talk. You can unmute, you can talk, call out something.
Not taking care of their apartment,
Yes.
not
Their
taking care of
apartment.
themselves,
Yep.
their presence and their look is
Yep.
changed.
Those are really good early warning signs, right? Any kind of change like that. Not taking care of their apartment being trashed. Yeah, you want to think about that. What else do you see? Thanks, Juanita.
Engagement,
What?
not wanting to engage as much with case management,
Yes.
not being available for the appointments.
Yep. Feeling like a chase manager. That's what somebody said. I feel like a chase manager. If you're chasing people all the time, there's a reason they're not engaging with you. Is it always substance? No, but none of these things are always substance, but it could be substances, right? So you want to get to the bottom of it, especially if they've engaged before, right? If they had had a good relationship with you and all of a sudden the relationship starts to erode, you want to think about what's going on. Other stuff, we're looking for functional criteria. No? All right. So how does Housing First affect this, right? So does Housing First say people can drink as much as they want or use drugs as much as they want? No. Right, Brian, no. Housing First puts in the requirement that people have to follow the lease, right? So you have a way to functionally determine if the person is not doing well in certain areas, and the lease is a good one, right? So Housing First doesn't change the consequences, right? Somebody doesn't pay rent under Housing First. Do they still have to go through the eviction process? Yes, right? And the problem with some Housing First is people believe that if they screw up their housing, that they can get new housing right away. You have people who think that? Do you have people who came into your housing and not done well before in other housing and gotten evicted? Yes. Okay. So we want to look at what they've gotten evicted for, and we want to address those issues before. Why? Because we're putting the functional criteria. So can you address the issues of what got them evicted before they come into your housing?
Not paying their rent.
Right, but can you address that? Make a plan that say the person won't be accepted unless they figure out a way to pay their rent?
Yes, because for example, you can say this person needs to have a conservator before coming in.
Yes. Conservator or rep payee, or you work with the VA, Monique? No? Okay. Some people are going for conservators, some people are going for rep payee, but you can say that if somebody has been evicted, particularly multiple times for not being able to pay their rent, you say, okay, this is what needs to happen, right? Okay, so that's a good harm reduction, right? But does everybody get to address the problems in functioning before they come back to you? All right, everybody's face is like, yes, no, yes. Do you feel like you have that? Right? Our job is to help people meet the expectations of tenancy, right? So we need all the tools. So getting somebody a conservator or a rep payee, that's a good harm reduction approach for both substance and for tenancy, right? So you want things that'll affect both things. Why would it affect substance? They have less money to pay on substances, right? Okay. All right. So Housing First lets you do all these things. Services are voluntary in Housing First for the tenants, not for the staff. They expect you to do assertive engagement. Somebody says to get away from their door, okay, I'm coming back tomorrow, right? That's perfectly fine. We need to keep offering services. Services are wrapped around the person. It also reinforces, though you're not required to complete a treatment program before with Housing First, which makes sense, right? Treatment program doesn't necessarily predict people have addressed the eviction, address both the housing or the substance abuse stuff, but it does. If you're wrapping services around people, it means that we continually offer services, right? Which would include detox and include rehab. Doesn't mean people have to take them, but part of the job is to raise the awareness of these services and raise the awareness of why this would be helpful to them. The person also has to meet lease obligations. So lease obligations are like a functional assessment, right? So we want to think about that. And people should also be assisted. I mean, I don't know if you guys heard about this new thing that's coming up. New York has monkeypox. Have you heard about that? So New Yorkers are going to be required to wear masks inside, okay? So we are in tough times right now, and there's a lot of restrictions, how people fit, how far people have to be apart, the people have to use these remote things, which is not my favorite, the people have to wear masks. So some of those restrictions, we're also going to pair into our functioning, right? Somebody's really high, how likely is it that they wear a mask? No, right? So we're going to work on those functioning criteria. If people can follow the rules, right? And I don't care who they are. Mentally ill people have to follow rules. People who are high have to follow rules. That's the reality, right? That's how the company, that's how the nation is organized. It's around some kind of, so we want to make sure that they follow these rules. It's not anything goes, right? And we want to look at this functioning criteria, which is a big help to us. Okay. So PSH, each tenant signs a lease, right? And it leads out their rights and responsibilities. How many tenants have you got who really know their lease? Not many, right? So if the treatment opportunities are based on people seeing a problem, right? Because they have to agree. And the functional criteria is one of the things that gets people in. We want to really reinforce what's the functional criteria, and that's the lease, right? And we want to work on helping people follow the lease. So Juanita, you said that some of the people who are starting to use substances more and more and more, their apartments or their units are degrading, right?
Yeah.
So what do you do if somebody's apartment is not meeting the standards?
So you try to engage and ask them, if they need some help with cleaning the apartment, try to get, if you know the client, like this is not the norm for them, or, you do have some clients who are less cleaner than others, and that is their, norm, but try to engage with them and see what's going on. And, if they need offer any help, or, are they seeing their therapist, and, just trying to be engaged and trying to help them as much as we can. If they'll talk to you, some of them sometimes won't engage. They won't, talk to you about what's going on. So you have that to deal with as well.
Who's going to make the demand? Is the landlord going to send them a notice? What if their apartment is in really bad shape?
And the landlord sends them a notice. And, like I have a situation where I have a client who
Good.
we can't even go into the apartment, but the landlord sent her apparently a letter, but she never told me about the letter. And the property manager called me. And, I told the property manager if, that was the case and she was trying to get the individual out of the unit, that could she please forward me over that same letter that she sent the client.
Did she
so
do
I
that?
can have proof. So I can have proof as well.
Yeah, did she do that? The
No.
property? Okay, so one of the criteria is that people have to know what the expectations are. And who sets the expectations? You did a really good job in separating out services. We problem solve with people. We help, we assess people. We see if they can do it, right? But somebody's got to make the demand that this is a problem, right? And the landlord can send them a letter, but if they don't send it to us, it's absolutely no help. Okay, so I would suspect that most of the tenants that I know that got letters from property managers and landlords threw them out. And I'd say to them, did you get a letter from your landlord? They'd say, no. And I know they got a letter from their landlord, right? So it's hard to use it as leverage if we don't know about it. So we want to make sure that the landlords send us a letter, call us and tell us a letter. And I would say to the person, look, the landlord just called me and said they sent the letter, right? So this is a problem. So how are we going to deal with it, right? And they could say that landlord's unreasonable and everything else. Okay, but let me show you where it is in the lease. So the landlord has a right to send you a letter about the apartment being degraded, right? And in order to stay here, then we can have the conversation about, do you like it here? What's going on? But it gives us a little more leverage. Anybody else, does anybody here get letters from landlords? Do you all get a copy of the letter? So you've got to judge the person's functioning, right? How many people here call the landlords at least once a month? Nobody. Okay, so we've got to set up some sort of communication where people understand we're talking to landlords and we get a copy of the letter. We're not going to enforce the lease, but we're going to help people meet the expectations of the lease. And without that information, it's hard to do, right? So that's one of the things that we need, right? Because that's how leverage works. The other thing is that landlords sign an agreement with the subsidy administrators. DMHAS in this case, in most of your cases, right? DMHAS is the one. So they sign an agreement that says they will enforce the lease in an equitable, right, and fair manner. They'll also keep the premises safe and they'll meet the housing quality standards and they'll collect rent on a regular basis. Do your landlords do that? All right, let me ask this a different way. How many people get a how many landlords get a subsidy? And if the person doesn't pay their little piece of the rent, they don't say anything for a couple of months, either to you or to them. So they let it go until they don't. And then they say this person is 3 months behind in the rent. Has anybody seen that?
I have.
Okay. But if the functioning criteria is what gets us back to the diagnosis, and we're supposed to work on people meeting the expectations, if you get it after 3 months, then what is it? It's a crisis, right? But if you find out 2 weeks after their rent was due, then you can work with it, right? So in order to work with people who are using, we have to understand what are the expectations of functioning, and we have to be able to use them. So we got to figure out a way that you get it. Either you get a landlord who sends you the letters, or that's great that Juanita's landlord called her, but you know what? Maybe we need to call the landlords at least once a month. Find out what's going on. Will they always tell us? No, but you know what? It gives us a better shot.
I take the practice, if I may. I've always taken the practice, and I encourage my team to do the same, to check in with landlords,
Yep.
to look at landlords as an extended client, if you will, the same way we check in with our clients.
Absolutely
Check
right.
in with landlords, let them know that they have support, because a lot of times landlords will, allow us to use their units for one of our clients based on that honor system, that they will have that kind of support if something does go left. So the better communication we have with landlords and the more support that they see that they'll get from staff, the more willing they are to open up other units.
That's exactly
for
right.
other clients. So I tend to treat landlords like they are clients to an extent.
I think that's absolutely right. So Marcus, one of the things in supportive housing, as we know, if we communicate with landlords, we also can really be case managers, right? Because we can point to these other things. Otherwise, we're saying, you look like you've been drinking a lot. And they say, you look like you've been drinking a lot, right? But you got this problem with keeping your apartment or not paying rent. Tell me what's going on and let's problem solve it. And so you can point out to people the downside of the substance use. So it's a good, Marcus, what agency are you from?
Mercy Housing.
That's great. Perfect.
With that, when you have that kind of rapport with landlords too, they tend to treat your clients a little different than they would a regular market client.
Yep.
So they see something as, spiraling out of control. They tend to, have a little more compassion or sympathy or understanding rather, or better yet, they may not understand. They may not even care for it, but they will extend more patience.
Yep.
Because you have that rapport, and they'll communicate with you, and they'll even extend that level of patience towards the client tenant.
Yep.
Because of that relationship that you have with the landlords.
So it's possible to renegotiate, to say, give me a week to work on this, that sort of stuff. But if you don't have a relationship with a landlord, you can't do it, right? So how many people can solve this problem overnight? Nobody, right? We're not Oprah. We don't have like a car under your seats. You got to have that relationship with the landlord so you can get it early, right? Because a lot of this stuff takes time to negotiate and takes time to engage people in the process of fixing it. And if we can't negotiate with landlords, that's a problem, right? Or if they're separate entities and they don't feel themselves. So Marcus's point about treating the landlords like clients is exactly right, right? Does this make sense to people? We can't get people to follow the lease unless the lease is equally right, unless the lease is equally supported by the landlord. So the landlord has to, that's the whole functional separation in supportive housing. The landlord has to enforce the lease, but if we don't know about it, then how do we teach people how to follow the lease, right? And we've got to have landlords who understand that when we say we'll get back to you in a week, we really will get back to you in a week. It doesn't guarantee that every client will engage in the conversation, but it gives you a better shot. So anybody else treating landlords like clients or calling landlords on a regular basis? No? Okay. Can people see the advantage of getting this information early and working in concert with the landlords to get people to follow the lease? Yeah, okay. So it's something we got to work on. Okay. So part of it is the lease is the contract, right? People have had lots of treatment plans and they haven't worked out so well for them. The lease is the best shot at having a contract that sets down behavior that people have to engage in, that people will actually follow. It's a functional barometer. They oversee lease compliance. The lease must be consistently enforced. If Morgan does something and James does the same thing, and I tell Morgan, don't worry about it, and I tell James, I'm going to evict you, it doesn't make sense to people, right? It's not the functional stuff, right? James is looking like, yeah, that happens a lot. No. And it must be consistent with a community standard. Landlords cannot say people can't drink in our units, right? Yeah. You want to say something, James? You got to come off mute.
I was saying good morning to a coworker.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. You
I
can
got
just
a-
take, yep, go
A
ahead.
question earlier on. Now, we've had people that I think would benefit from having a rep PE, but how do we deal with a reluctance of the client to engage and head in that direction?
Okay, so there's two ways you can get a rep payee. One is voluntary that you're talking about, right? Which is you talk the client into it, and a fair amount of people can be talked into it. The other one is an involuntary rep payee. Does everybody use those? If you can get, and rep payees are a little reluctant, so you might be able to get anybody with a license to diagnose and treat it, but usually they require a doctor, though I don't believe that is in the SSI regs, but they're a little reluctant to do rep payees. So if somebody with a license, right, and who can diagnose and treat, usually a doctor says this person is unable to handle their money and need a rep payee, they'll get a rep payee. And the person can say, no, I don't want a rep payee, and it doesn't make any difference. Has anybody ever done that? And the advantage is they have to get another medical opinion to get off rep payee. Whereas if you do it voluntarily, you can just request to get off rep payee.
Can I say something, Andrea?
Sure.
In my own experience, I've had people who have been reluctant to proceed with a rep payee or a conservator. However, what I do, I put it back on the participant, and we talk about housing, and we talk about the fact that, moving forward, to have a plan in place in order to keep their housing, because they have a series of, like, a pattern.
Right.
So I point certain things out to them, weighing the pros and the cons. And, as much as our participants, they might be participating in certain activities, they want to save their housing. And because they want to save their housing, they will do whatever it takes. So, putting it back on them and letting them know, making this decision will certainly save your housing. Many times it gets through to many of them.
And it will save their housing. And that, you know what, that's a good example of convincing somebody to voluntarily go for a rep payee, right? And you've also got to, sometimes people actually put it in the plan. If they go for a rep payee, then the landlord won't go for eviction. It also requires that you get people to talk about what they value in their housing. So it means we integrate that. If people can't see the value in their housing, and I've had plenty of people who say, okay, I'll just be homeless again, right? And then that structure won't work. But if you're working all along to identify the things that they like about their housing, I call it equity in their housing. If they see the value in their housing, they are more likely to go for that. And yes, landlords can absolutely say that I have to have a guaranteed rent, and that comes through the following things. And so if you get rep payee, I am gonna withdraw this eviction complaint. Yep, that's a great one. And that's a good voluntary thing. Monique, have you ever done involuntary where you get a doctor to sign that this person is unable to do it?
No, I've never gotten one of those.
Has anybody ever gotten one of those? Are you uncomfortable with it? Are you? Anybody uncomfortable with it? Do people think it's not housing first? Okay.
I haven't done it personally, but being that I work with veterans, we also sometimes collaborate services with the social worker at the VA, and many times the social worker will, you know, get it done involuntarily.
Yep. And that's a conservatorship, right? Or a fiduciary is what they call it at the VA.
Yes.
Okay. But you can also do that with rep payee. You can also go for a conservatorship. Conservatorship bar is a little higher, but you can go for a conservatorship or a rep payee in the community. I also have to say that the case manager's job, if you get somebody a rep payee, is to work with them to learn how to manage their money so they can come off of rep payee, right? You also have to look at the rep payee services, right? So the rep payee may pay their rent, which will keep them in housing, but give them the lump sum of the remainder of the money. And that can cause all sorts of substance use problems, right? So you also want to look at the type of rep payee administrator that you get. But that's a great example. Other people done rep payee? Have you guys talked to the supervisors in your program about getting somebody ordered onto rep payee? And how to figure that out? The problem is a lot of the treatment facilities that will order rep payees are local. So you want to do it. But you should know that the original Housing First had a doctor on staff because it was an act issue. And they put everybody on rep payee, which, by the way, I do not agree with, right? But because I don't think everybody needs rep payee. But you know what? It's something to think. It's something to think about. It's about having somebody who can get somebody on rep payee if you need it. Okay. So the other part of our job is, as Monique said, we're going to increase people's equity in their housing, how much they like their housing, why they want to stay in housing. They've got to be able, this is really change talk, y'all. Think about your motivational interviewing. It's having people talk about why they want to keep their housing, right? Understanding the lease requirements and tenancy requirements. And we're going to explain that to people over and over again, but it's most consistently reinforced by a landlord enforcing the lease. If a rule is not enforced, come on, you all know this, right? If you make a rule and you don't enforce it, do people believe it's a rule? No, right? So unless the landlord can give us early warnings, right? And look, it's not like we don't know patterns. This isn't necessarily related to substance use. One of the things we find is once people move into housing and they get money, and God forbid if they get money for the first time in years, they blow it on other things. Sometimes they blow it on decorating their apartment. We know that. The first month is not a panic time, right? But we want to get it so it's not a crisis, and we get early warning systems. And it might just be that we've had people reunite with their adult children and the adult children want money, right? It's not always substance, but we want to pay attention to that, and we want to get an early warning system because we don't want people to get evicted, and we want to be able to deal with it. But we also, in order to have that come true, we need to connect people with the benefits of tenancy. Sometimes it's as simple as having your own shower or having your own bathroom or being able to cook something, right? It's different from living outside. It's different from living in the shelter. And we want to contrast those two things all the time. Because functional criteria sometimes doesn't work unless people value it. So as I said, we want to look at this. Yes, renting, we have had people rent their unit, sometimes to drug dealers, sometimes from prostitution, right? That usually means that people have a desperate need. And look, drugs and alcohol are a huge motivator, right? They need more money. So if you got somebody doing that, it's a pretty good shot. Noise complaints, big thing. As Juanita said, maintaining the unit to standard. Traffic. We want to look at traffic, right? We also want to know that in some cases, in the most extreme, people let people take over their apartment in exchange for drugs. Usually drugs, usually not alcohol, but I guess once in a while alcohol. So that they'll let somebody deal out of their apartment, they'll let them stash stuff in their apartment, which gets people in all sorts of trouble. We want to stop it before it gets to that point, right? By the way, if people are dealing, that's poison to a building. So we want to really jump on that. That's a crisis. Other things that people are seeing? No? Okay. So one of the things we want to educate people on is the rights and responsibilities of tenancy. And part of the responsibility is I'm talking about having sketchy people in and out of the building all the time, is that disturbs the other tenants. Why? Because they're scared in the hallways, right? So this is where in the lease, this is seen as a problem. Other tenants are complaining about the people noise. Other tenants have the right to quiet in their apartment, particularly after what's commonly seen as quiet hours, which is after 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock at night, depending on the building. It's, you know, an agreement between the landlord and tenant to work together, and the landlord's following their subsidy agreements, which means they equitably reinforce the lease. The other thing is having resources to clean things up, right? And hopefully you'll need these less and less and less because you're going to get early warning systems. But if you got 3 months back rent, making an agreement where the tenant pays it back is sometimes really hard, right? So you might want to do a combination of backups, and you should know where those are, right? Because let me tell you something, your tenants know those are out there. And if their entire focus with you is to get to those resources, just tell them, yeah, these are resources, but you know, they're not going to do it more than once a year, or what are the criteria? Same thing as when you're having a housing conversation. The other thing is to know your timelines in the eviction process, and people cannot be just evicted because they're 1 month behind on the rent. They have to go through a process. Once again, in the subsidy agreement, landlords say they're going to go through the process. So knowing how long you have, as Marcus said, if you're working with a landlord, you're going to get more time. But even without that, though, I would really encourage people to work with a landlord. Do you know what the eviction process is? Yes, no? You want to know that because you want people to work that system, right? That they can make an agreement to pay back the landlord, or make an agreement to clean up their apartment within a certain amount of time. And then Juanita's point is maybe they need help doing that. Maybe you guys do that. Maybe you can get outside help to do that. But you want to know what's a reasonable time. So I'll give you an example. If people are hoarding, right? You all got people hoarding. Sometimes that's related to drugs and alcohol too. So if they're hoarding, right? They have, it's a health and safety violation, and they have 5 days to clean it up. So we want to let tenants know that, right? But the landlord lets them know that too, and then say, okay, so what can we do in 5 days to make this apartment livable, right? It's not going to be a palace, but it's going to be livable. And watching them do that, right? And making an assessment about how they do that brings in that functional criteria for substance use. Right? And we can point it out. You want to keep this housing. It's really hard for you to do this. We can get you some help to do this. And I'll tell people, it looks to me like it's the drugs that are getting in your way. And they say, no, it's not. And I say, okay, why do you think I think that? Why do you think I think that? And I point out the functional stuff, and then I drop it. and I come back and I come back and I come back, right? Give people examples. We're also going to do some crisis planning about how people can ask for help. That's going to help get them into treatment eventually. And then we're going to do some policies on involvement, right? So if you're getting people evicted for hoarding, do you help clean up the apartments? And if agencies don't help clean up the apartments, then we've got to figure out some way that an outside resource can help them. How can we offer this help? By the way, with Rep Payee, you can pay for that help. All right, is this making sense to people? I'm looking at everybody's sort of looking at me. Yes? Okay. So part of this is stages of change, right? And a symptom of substance abuse, actually a symptom of mental illness sometimes, is that people don't have awareness of the problem, right? It's not the drugs, it's the landlord. It's not the drugs, it's that this is happening, right? Okay, they don't have awareness of the problem. We want to ask them questions that raise their awareness. And we want to ask them in the context of how they function. Your goal is to keep your housing. Let's talk about how you can do that, right? And let's talk about how this is hard for you. Or your goal is to, part of the functioning is financial, right? You have to go down to SSI to straighten out a problem with SSI. We want to set it up so people go down when they're abstinent. So they go down first thing in the morning, you go with them, and then ask them what the difference is between when they went down when they were abstinent, not sober, abstinent, right? And when they went down when they were high. It's how you use the functioning criteria. So you want to ask them questions. How did this work out this time? All right, look, I had a client, he used a lot of drugs, right? And he went down to SSI, he didn't go down with a worker, and he was a wild man. He was all over the place. He couldn't tolerate waiting. He was eventually banned from SSI, okay? And his theory was those people in SSI are really mean. And I tended to agree with him. I mean, some of those people in SSI were really mean, but he'd still made a mess there, right? So the next time we got him first thing in the morning, we went down with him, we helped him manage the waiting process, and he had the interview. And then we had a conversation about what was the difference between those two things and highlighted the fact that he hadn't shot up that morning, right? We also knew that he wouldn't be able to withstand it at much past 9:30. So we did some advocating to get him in fast, right? But his experience with being down there and abstinent before he got high in the morning was different. And he could see that. Okay. Pros and cons of changing and not changing. Using less, using differently, using on a different schedule, getting things done when they're abstinent. We want to talk about that. What are the pros and cons? It all seems surmountable until you start to talk about the pros and cons. At this point, you start to make plans, how they strategize. This is where treatment comes in, bunch of different things, right? People may decide that they just want to get sober on their own. Okay, right? Let's make a plan for that. Do we think it's going to work? Usually not, but it might, right? But it's a process of ruling it out. So we want to have that conversation. And then as they begin to change their behavior, we want to give them some support. And we also want to do some relapse prevention and normalize relapses, whatever the behavior is. As they sustain change for the next 2 to 3 months, we want to get new goals. And it might be moving out to another apartment and getting a good landlord reference. Because goals provide people with structure and treatment. And in order to give up any kind of behavior, people have to have structure and purpose, and they have to see progress. They've got to have a feeling of competency to continue to try it. Because decreasing drug use and alcohol use or giving it up is a really hard thing. And it is not immediately, you don't feel better, you feel worse, right? So they've got to have some place to gauge progress, and that's the functional stuff. And then as people relapse, we're going to try to keep the relapses as short as possible. We're going to reassess their stage, what they're thinking about, and we're going to intervene as possible. So basically, this is just techniques that we can support the stages of change. Is this helpful? Do people get training on stages of change? Yeah. Is it Monday morning? You guys were hot all weekend? What's going on? Okay. The other thing that we mentioned is people have to have hope. They have to have hope for a change, right? This is the core of motivational interviewing. They have to think it's possible, and they gauge that on other changes they've made. Doesn't have to be strictly related to drugs and alcohol. It also has to have meaning to them, so they need to want to maintain their apartment, and we're going to work on that a lot. And then people need to believe that they can do it, and they base that on other feelings of competency to make change. And we want to really support this. I know you can do this. And we want to try that decisional balance sheet, the good things about what I'm doing now. Why do we want to know the good things about engaging these drugs and alcohol and keeping their house a mess, or not paying rent? What's the good things about not paying rent? You got a lot more money in your pocket, right? You do. I mean, wouldn't you all like to have a holiday from rent or mortgages for like 3 months? What if you got every summer off? Would that be good?
Absolutely.
There you go. So, right, we got to think about that. There's some good things about not paying rent, and we're going to get to the functioning, right? And one of the good things they feel like is they can buy more drugs and alcohol. The not so good things is they don't have much money, right? As they spend up their money all the time. You all ever heard of a check day girlfriend or boyfriend? You know what that is? That's the girlfriend or boyfriend that shows up when the check comes in, helps the person smoke up all their money, and then leaves right after. Sometimes it takes a hot 5 hours. Right? Seen that? It's usually tied with substance abuse. That's a very compelling thing, right? They have company, they have somebody to have friends with. They believe they'll never get in another relationship again. This is the only way they do it. It's a very compelling thing to give up. What are the good things about changing? They weren't cut off of SSI. They can keep their apartment. This is where all the equity in their apartment comes in. And then the not so good things about changing. I've done this before. I've given up drugs and alcohol before, and I felt terrible. And that's true. People are going to feel terrible. There are ways we can help them with that, but unless we know about it, we can't do it. Is this making sense? Sorry, I keep asking you guys that. I can't tell from your faces. Okay. A lot of people went off camera. All right, so what does that mean? Does that mean this is not helping? What's it mean? Huh. Okay, all right. You guys, this is a lot better if we have a conversation, if you guys tell me what you're thinking. Otherwise, I'm just going to go through this rote thing, huh?
I think it's very helpful, especially for individual case managers who may be new to the field, or they just get a caseload, and you know, they experience some of these things that we're talking about. Makes it better for us to understand and know how to go about things.
And it brings in all of these other things, right? So a lot of the theme here is how tenancy connects to this. So it gives you something to work with. I agree. I think a lot of you guys are doing this already, but it also gives you a framework to do it in, right? I think that you're doing it because you know it works, right? And which is basically how this was evolving. They watched real practice and they saw what worked, right? So that's what we're trying to do. Okay, have you ever done an importance ruler? It's a motivational interviewing thing. So you take a piece of paper and you say, how important do you on a scale to 1 to 10 is keeping your housing? And the person says 4, right? The real truth is sometimes it's 0 and sometimes it's really 4. How important to you is your friends coming over? 9. How important is it to you to drink with your friends? 10. That's really a 20. How important is, because you got it from this bad things, right? When I drink and when I have friends over, people keep bothering me. How important is it to you to stop people bothering you? 10. Okay, so what we're going to try to do is highlight the things that aren't working for them, like people bothering them. Why do you think they're bothering you? And this is part of this. We're going to also try to increase their importance of keeping housing, right? And we're going to negotiate that friends coming over. Maybe their friends are important to them, but is it important to them that their friends are in their apartment, right? And then get them to talk about the positives and negatives of having friends over. One of the big negatives that I always tried to pull on was the friends don't leave, particularly if they're using, right? They get in trouble with the landlord, but that's usually not their primary. It's that they can't get their friends out, right? So you want to take a look at this importance rule. You want to take this stuff, you want people to rate it, and you want to use that as a guideline to how you're going to talk to people. Anybody see this as important? Has anybody tried this before? Is this something you could try? Would you see it as helpful? You're probably not going to know until you do it, but try it. And look, evidence-based practices are based on real practices, but not everything works for every person. So if you give it a good try and it doesn't work, try something else, right? Just because it's an evidence-based practice doesn't mean it works every time. You should know about this stuff. You should have it as a tool in your toolbox. By the way, sometimes it doesn't work with somebody and then you try it again 2 hours later and it does work. It's very confusing. Sometimes it works with one person, but not another one. So don't throw out the whole thing. Try it with a couple of people. See if it works. The other thing, and this is absolutely my favorite. So a friend of mine calls this the curious idiot stance. Does anybody see, you guys look pretty young, so probably not when Columbo was first on. Has anybody here seen Columbo? Yes. So they're on reruns. It's pretty interesting. And he's a detective that says to people basically, help me understand. I don't understand what you're talking about. Help me understand. And it gets people to talk about it. So people say, I'm going to move back to the encampment. Help me understand that. Tell me what the encampment was like. What would life be like? How would it be different than housing, right? Because people often tell us stuff like, if you're going to bug me about the drugs and alcohol, I'm just moving back to homelessness. Have you guys heard that? So how do you continue that conversation? Ask them about it. And I use that expression all the time, my Columbo expression. Help me understand. What's the encampment like? What did you like about that encampment? You find out things like what you can do to replace. I had friends in the encampment. So how can you have friends and do things you like without, getting thrown out of your housing? Have you ever thought about, maybe you could meet your friends in the park, or maybe you could do it somebody else's apartment, or maybe you could try this. But you're going to try a bunch of options based on what they say. So what it would be like to have another place to drink with friends. I had a guy who was drinking a lot of alcohol, raising all sorts of ruckus in the apartment building, was about to get evicted. And I said to him, well, what about if you found another place to drink? What about if you went to somebody else's apartment? And he said to me, oh no, that would never work. Because when people come to my apartment, they bring the drink and the alcohol. If I go to somebody else's apartment, I have to bring it. So it's much more expensive for me to go to somebody else's apartment. So that never occurred to me. Okay. So what about other things you could do, right? It's help me understand this. What would you do? I wonder if there's anything you'd miss with housing. There's things I would miss about my housing, right? For instance, I really like my bed. I mean, have a conversation to raise people's awareness. Be curious. Ask them what's working for them. Ask them what's working about the drugs and alcohol. Drugs or alcohol, right? Part of us gets into this stuff. If we think about heroin and fentanyl's in most heroin right now. And we think about you could actually die. Personally, that horrifies me, right? And it's really hard for me to ask somebody what they like about that drug when I think, oh my God, it could kill you, right? But you got to contain your own anxiety, because if you don't know what they like about it, you can't help them find an alternative. So this helps you do that. I call it the Columbo technique. As I said, my friend calls it the curious idiot, right? It just means we're just asking people what they think. Have you done this before? I know some of you guys are doing this. Okay. Wait, oh. Never tried, it seems helpful, something I definitely want to try. Yeah, it's fun. It's actually kind of fun. Particularly watch a rerun of Columbo. It's unbelievable, and you'll make you laugh. Okay. Somebody said they just started here. Ah, here we go. Clients was evicted and we had no clue. Yeah, that's a big problem. Use a budget sheet. A budget sheet is important, but getting people to talk about the budget, right? That's, once again, that's really good. What you're doing is you're really raising their awareness of the functional or the expense of the alcohol and drugs. But how do you best do that? I usually ask people, instead of just saying a budget, I don't know. I mean, I love Columbo. All right. So one of the things that happens is when I used to talk to people about a budget, they would do anything to get away from me, right? And their experience with budgeting was that somebody was going to take something away from them. So I started asking people, so how much money do you need to live on? And every one of them said $100,000 a year, because it sounded like a nice round number, right? Knowing that that's a $7,000 goal, we say, okay, so how would you spend your money if you had $100,000? So now you got a little bit of money. How are you going to get to this $100,000? How can you use this money to leverage it? And talk to them about a plan. So it's a way to get to a budget it's a goal-focused way to get to a budget, which means people are more likely to engage in the plan. But you're always going to talk about, like, okay, so how much do you spend on alcohol? How much do you need is what I usually ask people. They're more open to that. Okay. So that's tough. So you know what? In order to get that much alcohol, you may need to get a job. But the problem with a job is you can't be high on the job. So is there a time of day you could have a little bit of a job so that you have more money to get? And pretty soon, people have periods of abstinence and we can start working with them towards it, right? Look, can we force people into treatment? Probably. But you know what? Treatment only gets 10%. I really believe in treatment, but treatment is much more effective when people can see the need for it and see the reason for it. And if we can get people through this process of engaging them, and I call these pre-treatment services, they got a much better shot at it. And that's really what we're focusing on here, right? And then it goes way up from 10%. Okay. So I'm going to give you an example. And what I want you to do is either write in the chat or, so here we go. So Bruce has been in housing for 6 months. He worked really hard to get it. He has no interest in seeing case management team, but he does satisfy the requirement. This is a case management team in another place that required the people check in at least once a month. Not really talk, but check in. It's not engaging in case management. It's just they check in. So Bruce has been drinking more and more over the past couple of months, and he stopped seeing his cardiologist because he got on him on drinking. Bruce had congestive heart failure, and we finally got him a cardiologist, and the cardiologist talked to him about his drinking, and he said, I'm never going to go back there. Okay, that wasn't good. So his landlord's concerned, and he's getting complaints from other tenants about noise and people wandering around at all hours. That's usually substance. And the workers offered numerous ways for Bruce to resolve these problems, but Bruce wants no part of it. So do you think that Bruce thinks his drugging or drinking is a problem? No, right? He thinks the landlord's a problem. He thinks the fact he doesn't have enough money is a problem. He thinks that, you know, he even said the landlord's jealous of him because he has so many friends. Does this sound familiar to you? All right. So think about Bruce for a minute. So just either put in the chat or talk. I'd rather you talked, but you're welcome to put in the chat. What's going on with Bruce? Bruce look familiar to you? What's going on with Bruce? How is it with Bruce willing to talk about his substance use?
I think if I encountered this client, I would look at, well, look, here's what's going on. Here's what I'm seeing physically.
Yep.
Here's some of the changes I'm seeing.
Yep.
And I pointed out things that are just objective, that are factual, that are not, you can't argue with it. And I'd explain my concern about physical issues. I want to bring up a point. My first meeting with a client one time.
Yeah.
The first time I met with this client, he showed me his toe. He did have a history of alcoholism. He did have a history of issues with diabetes as a result of that. I'm looking at his toe. His toe's, you know, the size of, bigger than my thumb. It was huge. It was red. He had already had toes or one leg amputated, and I'm looking at that and I'm going, oh. I was very calm. I said, you're getting in my car and we're going to the emergency room now. And I brought him immediately to the emergency room.
Yep.
He had an infection. I was concerned that it could have been going septic.
Yep.
He was admitted to the hospital. He had been put on antibiotics, but he wasn't able to get to the pharmacy to get the antibiotics. The doctor had prescribed them.
Mm-hmm.
So he still continued to do what he wanted to do. This is years ago. He ended up being admitted. He did have diabetes. He had to go to dialysis, and over time he passed away. But you know, at least I was able to try to point that out and do the initial situation.
So you identified an imminent risk, which is this guy has history of diabetes and he's got a big toe that's all red, right? And infections are really serious. He had let it go before because he'd had a leg amputated, right? So you took control, which is great, right? But that one of the things is, the good sign is that he showed you his toe. He knew this was a problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
He wanted you to take control because he showed it to you, right? So that you can look at those things and you can assess risk. That's a great one, right? So with Bruce, you're going to assess risk and you're going to get him, you know, to the hospital, that sort of stuff. If he said he didn't want to go to the hospital, would you have called the ambulance?
If it's again, I've had clients that have, I've brought them to the hospital. There were issues. They were there with the doctors and they've left against medical advice. And I can't make a person, if he had left against medical advice, there's nothing I can do.
Well, there is, but you could follow up and you could ask these questions, right? Is that, how are you taking care of this toe? But he also showed you the toe.
Yeah.
right? So we want to really
Yes.
key into the fact that he was worried about this toe as well. He should be. He'd had a leg amputated, right? And then did you have a conversation about, you know, look, it doesn't always work, you know, and there's a lot of people that drink themselves and drug themselves to death every year, but we got to try, right? And that as long as we try, like you did, right, that's what we're supposed to do. So he had this bad toe. So do you have a conversation with him about how we could prevent that in the future?
My immediate concern was to get him to the hospital.
Right. Yes.
And deal with that. And there was follow-up, I guess, after that. But that was, he was admitted to the hospital.
Good. But he trusted
from
you
that.
enough to go there, and you went with them, and that was a good. So what about somebody who doesn't have imminent risk, but you're seeing something wrong? Do you ever use the thing about, I'm worried about you?
I've done that.
Yep. I'm worried about you. I care about you. I'm worried about you. That looks like an infection. Or I'm worried about you that, you know, I mean, have you ever seen people, it was more during the crack epidemic and the meth epidemic, but when people just drop all this weight, right? I'm worried about you dropping all this weight. It makes me wonder. You can also say, it makes me suspect that you're using crack or you're using meth, right? Not you are using crack and you are using meth, but it makes me think about that because it worries me. And then have a conversation with them. What about Bruce's friends that he's moving in there, that he's taken there, right? He's clearly got a thing. If he didn't have housing, would his friends come there? If he didn't have housing, would his friends bring the drug and alcohol? Probably not. So how can he balance those two things? Because how he sees his friends and how they come in and how he helps his friends is to have housing. But if he keeps helping his friends the way he is, he can't keep housing. So maybe there's some negotiation there. Okay. He sure is in denial. Yep. But most people are in denial. We're not going to, if we got a problem, we're not going to pick the thing we like the best and say, oh, I got to give that up. We're going to pick the things that annoy us first, right? Everybody does that. Okay. Prioritizing alcohol over housing. Yep. And how can those two coexist? He's not aware. Okay. So let's take this one, Monique. So the reason I showed you that screen on God, now I forget what it's called. Stages of change is because stages of change is a way to work with people before they've made a commitment to change. So in the past, especially around drugs and alcohol, and stages of change was actually invented around drugs and alcohol. It was actually invented around nicotine, which is a really hard thing to, is that people believed unless people were out of denial or unless people were admitting that the alcohol or drugs was a problem and that they couldn't change. But what stages of change proved is there are techniques to work with people before they have addressed before they've admitted a problem. So it gives you things that you can work with, right? So that's why we talked about stages of change. Okay, all right, let's get a little update on. So you want to look for the reasons to change and look for reasons to change that will matter to the person. Right? If we just say, this is going to kill you, man. Do they believe that? Nope. What if we say you're going to get evicted? Do they believe that? Nope, not unless the landlord's backing it up. You can't evict them, they know that. We also want to look at things that they want, right? We want to switch this to a more goal-based. Where do you see yourself living in the next year? Who do you want to live with? How do you want your life to look? Because if people have goals in mind, that gives them structure and purpose to move forward and gives them a reason not to do the things that they're doing that are interfering. What would be different if you changed the behavior? What would be different if you didn't change the behavior? Have you tried something similar in the past? How did that work? Have you ever given up anything? Have you ever decided that in order to get something you wanted, you're going to change behavior? We're going to ask people to tell us the story. What we're looking for is change talk. We're looking for hope. We're looking for meaning. We're looking for confidence, and we're looking for change talk. We also want people to think about problem solving. I usually engage in a conversation about how can you keep the drugs and alcohol and keep your housing, right? Because you know what? They're going to start to want other things besides housing, and that's going to move them towards giving up or changing their behavior with drugs and alcohol. But you don't want to take something away the first time, right? And let's face it, drugs and alcohol are pretty compelling. They give people a lot of relief. They make people feel better. And a lot of the things we suggest to people don't make them feel better. So it's a hard sell. So that's why we've got to get this change talk going. So I'm going to update it, and then I'm going to divide people in groups, and let's see if that works better. So Bruce tells the team he'll give up his housing before he gives up his friends. Okay, thinks you want to take his friends away from him. He likes some of the things in housing, but he's ambivalent about it. Yeah, I could give up housing. I could live homeless again. He likes drinking with his friends, but he can discuss a couple of downsides of that. He actually talked about sometimes he just wants to be alone and his friends are always there. And that's hard for him. Good. We want those negative feelings to come out. He really doesn't love his housing. This is often a problem. If people don't like their housing, he'd be better off in a less closed in space. And he's interested in getting a small house, but he doesn't think it's possible. Is that possible eventually? Yes. But there's going to be things that he's got to do in order to get that, and that's going to include less drugs and alcohol. He doesn't want staff to visit him because they bring bad news. He wants people to stop telling him he's, needs to stop drinking. So think about what your options are. By the way, this charming young man here is one of Bruce's friends who comes over with Heineken. Okay, so I'm going to divide people up into groups. Just going to divide you in 2 groups. So take 10 minutes and think about a little bit. What are your options with Bruce? So here we go. So you've got to affirmatively select the group, and that's really the question is, what are your options with Bruce? See those? So take 10 minutes and we're going to come back at 11:29. If you have questions, just come back to the main room. Okay, good.
This meeting is being recorded.
Here we go. Okay, what'd you guys think? What's your plan? What are you going to do with Bruce? You can put it in the chat box or you can talk. I think it went very well. Okay, good. You guys got a plan with Bruce? Anybody? Nope. Was that helpful? Yeah, maybe. Okay. All right.
Well, we basically talked about, tapping into the things that matter to Bruce.
Perfect.
Because a lot of times we want to meet our participant where they're at.
Yeah.
He did mention that he doesn't like people telling him to stop drinking. So
Yep.
I'm going to explore other options of how we may approach that situation.
Yep.
Also, he said he likes drinking with his friends, but can discuss a couple of downsides as well. So we want to tap into those things as well. So we want to meet him where he's at, and we want to also explore some pros and cons with him and discuss that.
That's great. Perfect. So found an appropriate group to help him manage his addiction. Okay, so you already identified options. That's good. That's great. All right, let's see what else we got here. Reducing his meeting frequency. Yeah, is that, maybe he doesn't have to give up his friends, but maybe he can meet with them a little less. So what you guys are describing is basically a decisional balance sheet. Okay, so what are some good things? They need me. My friends need me. I feel like I fit in. I have people to talk to. We have a good time. No nagging. My friends don't nag me. I'm comfortable with them. But what are some not so good things about drinking with his friends? The landlord complains. He really doesn't want to scare his neighbors, right? He wants his neighbors to like him, but he knows he's scaring his neighbors. Sometimes they get on my nerves, which is your downside, right? You guys could add stuff. The other thing is they don't ever leave. So what are some not so good things about making a change? I won't have a way to relax. So it's interesting. He needs ways to relax. What about my friends? He's worried about his friends. Life will be boring. It's hard, nothing to do. But what are some good things about making a change? People get off my back, which Monique mentioned, right? I can get some peace. And you want to know what that means to him. I might be able to stay in housing. So it sounds like he's increased his equity in housing. And I might be able to get a reference from a landlord because he's thinking about that goal, right? So these are all things you talked about. So what happened is that Bruce was able to cut down on his friends visiting. He actually got help from a peer support specialist who can talk to people about what it's really like. He's still drinking a lot, but it's mostly outside the apartment. He talked to his landlord about getting a reference. He's been looking at houses, but it's still a dream, so he can actually see that goal. He is not seeing drinking as the problem, but he addressed it as a housing issue, and the drinking was expensive, and he wants that house. So he found out something, maybe he wants a little more than the drinking with his friends. Wants that long-term goal. And he spends a lot of time with his friends, but he's beginning to see them differently. As people change their behavior, they're not as drawn into old behaviors. One of the things that we found is that we got people to come back to the shelter and talk to people about how to get housing. And it reinforced that they're now different from the people in the shelter. And they were less drawn to come back to the shelter. So it's an interesting idea, right? Basically, what we're describing here is harm reduction. And it means safer use, which mitigates the consequences. Let's be clear. Harm reduction does not change the consequences. It changes the behavior and gives people a control of changing the consequences. Harm reduction can include abstinence, but it can also include reduced use. It's applied to substance abuse, medication noncompliance. So your guy with the diabetes is doing it. Psychiatric symptoms, risks of housing stability like non-payment of rent. And examples are in everyday life. Seatbelts are harm reduction. Designated drivers are harm reduction. So it accepts the person. It minimizes the harmful effects of behavior rather than ignoring or condemning them. The person's centric. It's well-being and quality of the individual and the community are criteria for success. It's non-judgmental, it's non-coercive, but it is persuasive. And the person has a voice. So examples of them are scheduling appointments, first thing in the morning, sleeping medications if somebody's responding to voices. It's not as good as psychotropic medications, but you know what? Sleeping medications might give them a little peace, and everybody else too. Changing shifts. Someone's not able to work, well, wake up early. You know, we had a guy who worked as a desk clerk in one of the supportive housing, and he worked an afternoon shift. In the afternoon shift, he was sneaking booze the whole time. And it was a big problem if he was a desk clerk. So instead of firing him, we offered him a morning shift and told him that under no circumstances can he drink on the job. And you know what? He was able to hold it off. And then he had 3 hours of sobriety, of abstinence every day. And it was different for him. So there we go. Never said you can't drink, you just can't drink on the job. That's the structure. Sometimes using different substances, sometimes people, like, if they drink hard liquor, they fight. If they drink beer, they fall asleep. Okay, we're going to talk about that. Eating is a big thing with harm reduction with substance abuse, because oftentimes people start drinking in the morning or start drugging in the morning because they're hungry. And if we can give them something else to replace it, budgeting for alcohol recreation, direct vendor checks, rep payee, these are all examples of harm reduction. So what do we do with harm reduction? The person identifies the goal and the paths to achieve them. And we're going to help people talk this through. So even if they have abstinence as a goal, they also should consider other obstacles that reduce risk. So the real point is reducing risk by changing behavior. And it's not applied to imminent risk situations. Like your guy who had the swollen foot and had diabetes, that was imminent risk. That wasn't a choice. He had to go to the hospital. But a lot of the stuff we deal with are long-term risks. It also remembers that recovery is a nonlinear process. So sometimes people need to take a couple steps back, and it's accessible. Harm reduction is accessible. So it's recovery focused, right? It's important that we identify goals. That's key to motivational interviewing, to stages of change, to harm reduction. And the person will determine which strategies move best. You know, there's a diagram that they use in motivational interviewing where you're in a car and you're not driving, the client is driving, and you don't have brakes, you don't have the other stuff. And what you do is we help people select paths and we support them. And even if we don't think it's going to work, we're willing to try it as long as it's not dangerous. And we're going to debrief them and we're going to reassess. And I tell people all the time, you know, doctors use the rule out process, and that's what you're using. You're using a rule out process. This has worked for me before. This is what I'm going to try. And sometimes you need to rule it out. Maybe that's going to work in this situation. Maybe that's not going to work in this situation. So let's say somebody wants to get a car, right? Or another house like Bruce. How much will that cost? How much does it cost to move? How much does everything out? What about insurance for a car? How does the person want to achieve the goal to get the car? What are their options to increase income? Timeline, how to get the worker to assist them. Is the worker are you just going to give somebody money to move or money to get a car? No, right? So how can we assist them? We can assist them to get maybe a job, but the job is going to have rules like the other job, right? Where people can't use on the job. You also want to talk about how substance affects the options to the goals, right? We're connecting it, just like housing. And then what are their risks? What are their strengths? And how does housing affect that goal? Okay. So here's a plan, right? The person is threatened with eviction because they have guests in the apartment, they're partying, and they're disturbing other tenants. That sound familiar? And they want to keep their housing. So what are their options? Maybe the guests are important to them. We know that from conversations. So maybe they can explore shared housing or roommates to be less lonely, right? That could solve the problem with the landlords. That would reduce the loneliness. But the person really wants their own control of their own apartment. So this may not work. But this harm reduction plan has a line for non-negotiable. Only people named on the lease can live in the housing. So they can't keep moving people in where they maintain the only lease. All right, so maybe I'll find another place to socialize, to drink with my friends. That would reduce the impact on the neighbors. That's good, but it might cost something and they might not be welcome. And drinking, smoking is not permitted, right? May not be permitted, like in a park or something. If they say, well, I could do this in a park, but it might be illegal, right? So that's non-negotiable. You can't, most parks you can't drink in, right? Most parks in Connecticut you can't drink in, right? Go to the beach in Connecticut, to a state park, can you drink? Can you get rowdy? Can you do drugs? Probably not. So they need a more private space. Okay. So maybe I can figure out a time to see my friends and fool around with my friends and drink with my friends that's not as disruptive. Like maybe I could do this during the afternoon. And that might decrease the effect on neighbors. But the client who I was doing this with actually said, what kind of animal has people over to drink and drug in the afternoon? You're supposed to do that at night. And I thought, okay. So his friends weren't up. They didn't want to socialize earlier, but you must always allow neighbors quiet enjoyment. So we're going through these options and we're ruling them out one by one. Is this format useful to people? Actually, charts work quite well with people, right? It lets you ask the question, you write it down, you do a little reflective listening. Okay, I want to put this down as a sentence. It's how we do it oftentimes. So basically, case management assists people to access housing and maintain it, right? And drugs and alcohol are often seen as a barrier to housing, right? Because it causes behaviors, right, that limit their functioning. So, but housing has a structure and rules, and we want to use that format to help people see how alcohol is interfering in their goals in life. It allows the team to offer treatment options, behavioral change as options to follow the lease. And all of those options actually lead to a greater awareness of how alcohol and drugs is interfering in their life, which improves the probability that treatment will work. People can maintain their homes in spite of substance use, right? We know that about 10,000, they say about 10% of the people in the United States have a serious problem with drugs and alcohol, but only 1% is homeless. So most people who have trouble with drugs and alcohol are housed. So it doesn't preclude it, right? But we've got to get their functioning up in the areas of tenancy. And it changes the relationships that people have with substances as they begin to think critically about it. So we want people to think critically about it. And what we're really after here is to raise their awareness about how alcohol and drugs interfere in their lives, which is a good path to eventual treatment or less drinking and drugging. Does this make sense? That's how we can use it in supportive housing. Okay. So here's some references. This is motivational interviewing from Miller and Rolnick. This is their website that you can go to get some more information. We did a lot of motivational interviewing and stages of change in this. You can get some information there. This is actually from Canada, a lot of this, and it was written about reducing harm from substances during COVID-19 and helping people follow the structure that they were expected to do. And it's very interesting, right? And these are some increased risks that happened during COVID-19 and probably still now. So there's safer drinking tips. There's guidance for people who use drugs and alcohol. There's an overdose prevention and harm reduction guidelines. That's from Connecticut Boss. It's from King County, which is in Seattle. And there's overdose prevention interim guidance during COVID-19, and that's from the Harm Reduction Coalition. And there's safer drinking during COVID. So these are ways to use sort of harm reduction techniques, or what I really call it is taking the goal step at a time. Would any of these resources be useful to you guys? Yeah, it's helpful sometimes. This is about harm reduction. Once again, this is from National Healthcare for the Homeless. There's a website. There's also a book called Not a Solo Act, which was written a long time ago with CSH, but it's about how to work with landlords, right? To help people with tenancy skills, which is the key to the functioning in drugs and alcohol. There's also a property management manual here. So I want to direct your attention to this. In the appendix of this property management manual, they give you letters that people can send to landlords, can send to tenants. So you don't have to write the letters to them. It gets them a more formal process. It also keys them into CC you on letters. And then there's a Narcan website. So are any of these helpful to people? Yeah, okay. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna wind it up today. I know it's a little early, but I want to give you guys time to do the evaluation. So Kaya's gonna come on and talk about the evaluation in a minute. And I want to really redirect people to if these trainings are working for you or not. And if there's other things you want, because we're really looking at this right now. So think about what kind of trainings you want, how you want the format. If you're really interested in going back to in-person, that's something we can talk about. It's a lot easier to be part of the conversation when it's in person. And I know people are zoomed out, so you can talk about that. You can talk about subjects, anything like that in the evaluation. So Kaya's going to talk about that for a minute.
Yes, and I just posted the link. I think I might have posted it twice. So some folks probably seen the first one, but I just reposted it too. It's the forms link that's in the chat. That's the evaluation. At the bottom, so it has some general like strongly agree, strongly disagree, but when you get to the bottom, it has an open-ended section for comments and suggestions. Please go ahead and put any training topics, any suggestions, etc., because we are looking to use this to inform future training. So yes, please fill out the evaluation, and please go ahead and fill out that last section where it's open-ended to tell us your thoughts and any recommendations.
So Kaya also mentioned in the chat that the slides as well as the recordings will be sent out.
Yes, in about 2 weeks, I'm going to send, probably sooner than that, since this is the last one and I'm trying to go ahead and finish this up for this particular session. But you will receive the PowerPoint presentation, a recording, any supporting material. So everything here you'll get in addition to your certificate for this training. So you'll get all that emailed to you.
So things people should know is that when you get the PowerPoint, you can just click on the PowerPoint. So you don't have to copy these links, which is a real pain. Okay, so you can get all this material. All right, y'all. Well, thank you. I'm going to let you guys do the evaluation. It's always a pleasure to see you, and we'll see you next fall.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.